She didn't slip. She didn't scream. She hit the water so fast the Atlantic swallowed her name before it left her mouth. 5 months pregnant, shoved off a 40 million yacht by the woman sleeping with her husband, while he stood there and watched. They thought the ocean erased her. They thought the empire was theirs. They were wrong. Now, here's the part nobody was supposed to know. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now, back to our story. A single shove, a silent gasp, and then a splash. At 9:47 p.m., 20 miles off the coast, Serafina Wolf, 25 years old and 5 months pregnant, disappeared from the deck of her husband's 40 million yacht. She didn't fall. She was pushed. And with that one motion, control of a 2.8 billion empire didn't just shift. It was stolen. The two people left on board were certain they'd just executed the perfect murder. They were wrong. What you're about to see is not a story about a simple affair. It's a story about a calculated corporate takeover disguised as a crime of passion. By the end of this, you will understand that the most dangerous predators don't hunt in the wild. They hunt in the boardroom and in the bedroom. But this story goes deeper than you think. It wasn't just a woman's life. It was about erasing her existence. To understand how a woman left for dead in the middle of the ocean could dismantle a dynasty, I need to take you back. Back to the week it all fell apart. Because before I show you the single frame of the video they forgot to erase, the frame that proved everything, you need to hear the lie Damien Wolf told his wife that sealed her fate. Serafina Wolf lived in a Manhattan penthouse where polished concrete floors stretched into a wall of glass. The city below looked like a distant, silent galaxy. Her life was a series of scheduled moments. Mornings were for the Wolf Foundation, her signature on a tablet approving 7-figure donations. Afternoons were for fittings, for consultations with chefs about state dinners. She was the flawless public face of her husband's empire. He was the tech king. She was his benevolent queen, now carrying the air. But on a Tuesday, the silence in that penthouse was a physical presence. The standing order for 200 white roses had arrived, their petals perfect and scentless. A housekeeper arranged them in a vase. No note. It was a transaction. Damien hadn't been home for dinner in 9 days. The staff served her solitary meals at a long marble table with 10 empty chairs. When he did return, long after midnight, he moved like a ghost through his own home, leaving only the scent of expensive whiskey and a sharp, floral perfume she didn't own. Their conversations were about logistics. "The charity gala is on the 5th, Damien. My flight to Zurich leaves at 6. He would look at her, but his eyes were always focused on a point somewhere behind her head, his mind already elsewhere. The source of that coldness had a name. Sloane Redding. Sloane didn't have a job title. She had territory. And that territory was Damien. As his executive assistant, she was the gatekeeper to his life. She moved with a chilling efficiency, her stillness a weapon in a world of noise. She wore severe, tailored dresses in shades of charcoal and black, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen her features. She saw Serafina not as a person, but as an obstacle. Serafina felt the change at a museum benefit. She stood beside Damien as he announced a massive donation. Cameras flashed. Applause echoed. Later, she saw Sloane across the room, speaking with 2 of Damien's board members. She wasn't an assistant, she was an equal. Damien caught Serafina's gaze, gave a quick, empty smile, then walked directly to Sloane's group. He placed a hand on the small of Sloane's back and leaned in. They shared a brief, conspiratorial look that shut everyone else out. Serafina turned away and took a glass of water. Have you ever had that feeling? That moment when your gut tells you something is deeply wrong, even when your mind is trying to deny it? Let me know in the comments. The final proof arrived Wednesday. Serafina had felt the baby kick for the first time, a sudden, powerful flutter. Joy, pure and uncomplicated, flooded through her. She had to share it. Damien was in a critical, all-day meeting. On impulse, she drove to his office tower, a small, gray gift box containing a pair of tiny sneakers on the passenger seat. She rode the silent elevator to the 50th floor. The air there was thin and cold, smelling of leather and power. As she approached the frosted glass of his corner office, she heard Sloane's voice. It was low, intimate, and laced with contempt. "She's a liability, Damien," Sloane said. "An emotional distraction. A man who builds empires needs a partner who understands the cost, not one who just enjoys the rewards." Serafina froze. Through the blurred glass, she saw his silhouette, motionless. He didn't defend her, he didn't move, he didn't speak. A long moment passed before Sloane's silhouette approached him. That was his answer. Serafina backed away from the door. The gift box felt heavy in her hand. She didn't run. She walked, posture perfect, back to the elevator. She pressed the button and waited. Not a single tear fell until the doors closed, sealing her inside the small descending box. That night, she waited in the dark. When Damien walked in just before 1 a.m., the click of the lock was loud in the silence. He found her sitting on the edge of their bed, the tiny box on the nightstand. She didn't yell. She looked at him, her gaze level, and asked a simple, lethal question. "What does Sloane give you that I don't?" For the first time in years, Damien Wolfe looked cornered. He saw the box, saw her eyes, and began to deny, his words clumsy and hollow. Then his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text. He glanced down. Serafina saw the briefest flicker of a message before he angled it away. It was from Sloane. His entire demeanor changed. The cornered husband vanished. The CEO took his place. He saw a problem and formulated a solution. "You're stressed," he said, his voice calm, clinical. "The pregnancy is making you paranoid." He delivered the next line with surgical precision. "Sloane mentioned it the other day. She said you seemed fragile, that I should take you away for a few days, just us, on the new yacht, to reconnect before the baby comes." He presented the other woman's idea as his own concern. Serafina, exhausted and shattered, heard the words reconnect and just us and clung to them. A lie was the only lifeline she was offered. Against every instinct screaming inside her, she nodded. Okay. It was a fatal mistake. The next day, as she packed a small suitcase, her phone rang. It was her sister, Ilara, a Chicago litigator. "A yacht trip?" Ilara's voice was sharp. "Sarah, you called me 2 days ago convinced he was having an affair. Now you're sailing off into the sunset with him?" "He said we need to reconnect," Serafina said, her own voice thin and unconvincing. "Men like Damien don't reconnect. They re-strategize. This is about him managing a situation. Please, be careful." "I will," Serafina whispered. As the sun set, a black car took them to the marina. The yacht, the Serenity, gleamed under the dying light, a floating palace of white fiberglass and chrome. Damien helped her aboard, his touch impersonal, his smile practiced for the skeleton crew. As they set sail into the vast, darkening water, Serafina stood on the deck, the wind whipping her hair. She glanced up at the bridge and thought she saw a figure in the shadows of the upper deck, a woman with dark, severe hair. The figure receded before she could be sure. The ocean was growing colder. Damien's legal team would later argue he was a man under extreme duress, manipulated by an ambitious employee. But what they couldn't explain was the billion-dollar insurance policy he'd signed just 2 days before they set sail. A policy that named him as the sole beneficiary in the event of Serafina's death. So, I have to ask you, was Damien a cold-blooded planner from the beginning, or just a coward who got in too deep? Comment planner or coward below. The truth is more complicated, and it all comes out on the dark waters of the Atlantic. The yacht, the Serenity, was a sterile capsule of light cutting through an ocean of black ink. The air was cold, heavy with the smell of salt and diesel. On the flybridge, Damien Wolfe stood with his back to the salon, a satellite phone pressed to his ear. His voice was a low, clipped weapon, the one he used for hostile negotiations. He gave orders, dismantled a competitor's stock price, and moved millions across continents. He was a commander on his warship, and his wife, standing in the doorway behind him, was an unwelcome civilian. Serafina held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The warmth seeped into her cold hands. She stood there for a full minute watching him, but he didn't turn. He knew she was there. The silence from her was a question he refused to answer. Finally, he ended the call with a curt, "Execute." He turned, and his eyes landed on the mugs she offered. There was no gratitude, just a flicker of mild annoyance, as if a steward had brought him the wrong vintage of wine. "I thought you might be cold," she said, her voice flat, refusing to betray the effort it took to sound normal. He took one mug without a word, his knuckles brushing hers. The contact was clinical, accidental. He took a sip, his gaze already past her, fixed on the dark horizon where the sea and sky merged into one. "We're having a good time," he said. "We should be at the designated coordinates by 0400. "The designated coordinates?" Serafina asked. The phrase was jarring, stripped of any romance. "I thought we were just sailing." "There's always a plan, Serafina," he said. The words were not a reassurance. They were a reminder of his control. His world was one of logistics, variables, and calculated outcomes. This trip was no different. He was executing a mission. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the deep, resonant thrum of the engines and the rush of water against the hull. Below them, a single deckhand moved like a shadow, checking lines, his face a blank mask. He was part of the machinery. Serafina sipped her own coffee. It was already cold. They moved inside to the main salon, a space of white leather and polished chrome that felt more like a corporate lobby than a room for relaxation. Damien sat at the large mahogany table, opened his laptop, and the cold blue light from the screen erased what little warmth was left in his face. He was gone again, absorbed into a world of encrypted data and financial projections. Serafina watched him, a slow, cold realization seeping into her. This trip wasn't for them. It was a mobile office. It was a holding cell. It was a way to contain the problem, her, while he continued his real life, uninterrupted. She thought back, trying to pinpoint the exact moment the man she married had been hollowed out and replaced by this machine. She remembered him years ago in a cramped Brooklyn apartment that always smelled of coffee and ambition. He had sketched out his first major software design on a stained napkin, his eyes alive, not with the thought of money, but with the raw thrill of creation. He had called it a symphony of code. Where was that man? She knew where. Sloane Redding had dismantled him, piece by piece, and rebuilt him in her own image. Sloane had taught him that sentiment was a rounding error and emotion was a bad investment, Sloane had convinced him that his symphony was just a product to be sold. Let's go back 6 months. Picture a boardroom on the 50th floor. Damien is at the head of a long table. The numbers on the screen are bad. A division he built from the ground up, one that employed over 3,000 people, is failing. His gut tells him to reinvest, to save the jobs, to honor the legacy. His board is pushing for a full liquidation. Cut limbs to save the body. Sloane is not at the table. She stands by the window, her back to the room. She waits until the arguments are over, until the room is silent, waiting for Damien's decision. He looks at her. "What do you think, Sloane?" he asks, his voice tired. She turns. Her face is calm. "I think legacy is a ghost, Damien," she says, her voice quiet but carrying across the entire room. "It whispers in your ear about the past, while your competitors are building the future. Those 3,000 employees are a number on a spreadsheet, a liability. Your sentiment for them is a cancer in your portfolio. You know what a CEO does with cancer." He looks down at his hands. He remembers the faces of some of those first employees. Sloane walks over and stands behind him. She places a hand on his shoulder. A gesture of solidarity that feels like a claim of ownership. "They will call you ruthless," she whispers, for his ears only. But history doesn't remember the sentimental. It remembers the strong. It remembers the kings. He closes his eyes for a moment. When he opens them, they are different, colder. "Liquidate the division," he told the board. That was the day the symphony died. Back on the yacht, the memory hung in the air like a ghost. "Damien," Serafina said, her voice cutting through the silence. He didn't look up. "Damien." He finally lifted his eyes from the screen, his expression a wall of impatience. "What is it?" "Do you remember that restaurant in Brooklyn?" she asked. "The one where you drew the schematics for the Titan project on a napkin?" He blinked, a brief, mechanical flicker of his eyes as he accessed a distant, archived file. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice flat. "We liquidated that entire division last quarter. It was underperforming." He had assessed a shared memory for its market value and found it worthless. He had put their past on a spreadsheet and deleted the row. "Legacy isn't about nostalgia, Serafina," he said, and the words were so familiar she realized he was quoting Sloane. "It's about relentless forward momentum. You can't build an empire if you're looking in the rearview mirror." "That doesn't sound like you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It sounds like her." For the first time, all night, a real emotion broke through his composure. Raw, unfiltered anger. He snapped the laptop shut. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "Sloane understands what it takes," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She understands that success requires sacrifice. It requires making unsentimental choices." He stood and walked to the bar, his movements stiff and aggressive. He poured a whiskey, his hand shaking slightly. "She told me this trip was a mistake. She said you wouldn't understand." "Understand what?" Serafina asked, her own voice rising, fueled by months of suppressed fear and anger. "That my husband has been replaced by a corporate memo? That our marriage is now a topic in your strategy meetings with your assistant?" "She is more than an assistant," he roared, slamming the glass down on the marble counter. The amber liquid sloshed over the rim. "She is the only person who sees the world the way I do, the only one who isn't afraid of the cost." "And what is the cost, Damien?" she shot back, standing to face him. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What is the acceptable loss? Your family? Your son? Me?" He just stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes like chips of ice. The accusation hung in the air between them, a declaration of war. He turned his back on her, the ultimate dismissal, and walked out onto the aft deck. The heavy glass door slid shut, leaving her alone in the cold, silent room. What would you have done in her shoes? Would you have stayed and fought for a man who was already gone, or would you have demanded to be taken back to shore? Let me know in the comments. An hour passed. A nervous-looking steward appeared and informed her, in a hushed tone, that dinner was served on the aft deck. He wouldn't meet her eyes. She walked out into the wind, which was stronger now, a physical force that tore at her hair and clothes. Damien was already seated at a small table, a single lamp casting a sickly yellow glow on his face. The sky was a churning mass of bruised purple clouds, and distant lightning flashed silently on the horizon, illuminating the churning sea. 2 plates of elaborate food sat between them, growing cold, untouched. An open bottle of wine sweated onto the white tablecloth. She sat down. The only sound was the howling wind and the rhythmic crash of waves against the hull. "I spoke with the legal team today," Damien said finally, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the storm. "About the new trust." "The trust?" she asked, her own voice calm, her emotions packed away into a cold, hard knot in her chest. "For the company," he said. "Sloane's idea, actually. A way to insulate the voting shares from outside influences, a firewall, to protect the empire." There it was, the purpose of the mission, the designated coordinates. He wasn't talking about protecting the company from competitors. He was talking about protecting it from his son, from her. "So that's what this is," she said, the words clear and sharp over the wind. "You brought me to the middle of the ocean to tell me my son is being written out of his own legacy. This isn't a reconciliation, it's an exit interview." He finally turned to look at her. There was no anger in his face now, no guilt, just a profound, weary emptiness. "It's not personal, Serafina. It's business. Everything with you is business," she said. She pushed her chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the deck. "Your life is a series of transactions, and it seems this one is complete." She turned to walk away, to go below deck, to lock herself away until this nightmare was over. "Where are you going?" he called after her, a hint of alarm in his voice. She didn't answer. She walked toward the stern, needing to feel the railing in her hands, to see the vast, unforgiving ocean. She gripped the cold, wet steel, staring at the black, swirling water below. Footsteps approached from behind, quick and heavy. "This conversation isn't over." It was Damien. "Yes," she said, turning to face him, the wind whipping her words away. "It is." And then she saw her. Stepping out from the shadows of the companionway, as if materializing from the storm itself, was Sloane Redding. She wore a simple, severe black dress that didn't move in the wind. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, her face pale and calm in the dim light. The figure from the marina. She had been on the yacht the entire time. Every paranoid fear, every dismissed intuition was real. Serafina felt the air get punched out of her lungs. Her gaze shot from Sloane's cold, triumphant face to her husband's. Damien didn't look surprised. He looked trapped. He was not a participant in this scene. He was a hostage. Sloane walked forward, her movements deliberate until she was standing beside Damien. She didn't look at Serafina with hatred. She looked at her with a calm, dismissive pity, the look one gives to a problem that is about to be solved. "He tried to do this gently, Serafina," Sloane said, her voice even and clear over the wind. "But you were never going to understand. You're from a different world, A world of sentiment. That world is over. She glanced at Damien, her look a command. Tell her. Damien stood frozen, a statue carved from cowardice. Serafina found her voice. A low, dangerous growl. Get off this boat, she said to Sloane. A small, cold smile touched Sloane's lips. I think you have it backward, she said softly. This is my boat now, my life, my man. She took a step closer to Serafina, backing her against the railing. It's time for you to go. It wasn't a dramatic, slow-motion act of passion. It was a quick, efficient, physical motion. A problem being removed. Sloane's hands, firm and strong, pushed hard against her chest. Serafina's feet left the deck. For one horrifying, weightless second, there was only the roaring wind and the black sky. She let out a gasp, but the storm swallowed the sound. Her eyes locked with Damien's. He didn't move, he didn't shout, he didn't reach for her. He just watched, his face a blank mask of shock and indecision. He just watched. Then came the impact, the shocking, paralyzing, bone-deep cold of the Atlantic Ocean. The water was a black, violent entity, pulling her down, tumbling her over and over. The weight of her dress was an anchor. The shock stole her breath. The life inside her felt like a stone, dragging her under. As the black water closed over her head, the last thing she saw were the receding lights of the Serenity, a distant, mocking star, and the two figures standing at the railing, growing smaller and smaller until they were gone. Blackness. A deep, empty void without sound or sensation. Then a whisper, a slow, rhythmic noise. In, out, breathing. Her own. The next thing she registered was a texture against her cheek. Cool, smooth silk. Then came the pain, a dull, heavy ache that settled deep in her bones, a physical memory of impact and crushing cold. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were fused shut. She was adrift, not in water, but in a haze of exhaustion. Time became a series of disconnected fragments, the soft click of a door opening and closing, the distant, high-pitched cry of a bird she'd never heard before, the feeling of a cool, damp cloth being drawn across her forehead, the sharp prick of a needle in her arm. There were voices, hushed and professional, speaking in calm, unhurried Spanish. They discussed her temperature, her heart rate, and the fluid in her lungs. She was a set of vitals, a project under careful management. She was alive, but she wasn't there. The first time she truly woke, her eyes cracked open to a sliver of brilliant white light from a gap in a heavy curtain. The room was silent, sterile, and smelled of antiseptic and fresh sea air. An IV tube was taped to the back of her hand. A thin plastic tube delivered oxygen to her nostrils. She tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea rolled through her, and a sharp, stabbing pain in her ribs shot through her chest, forcing her back against the pillows with a groan. A man was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, reading a physical book. He wasn't a doctor. He wore simple, dark gray trousers and a plain black shirt. He was young, maybe late 20s, with dark, unruly hair and a face of sharp angles. He was completely absorbed in the book, his focus absolute. She made a small sound, a dry rasp that tore at her throat. His head snapped up. His eyes, a clear, startling gray, locked onto hers. There was no surprise in them, only observation. He closed his book, marking his page, and stood. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, pouring a glass of water from a pitcher on the nightstand. He put a straw in it and held it to her lips without a word. She drank, the cool water soothing the raw fire in her throat. "Where am I?" she whispered, the words barely audible. The Isla del Silencio, he said. His voice was low and calm. My home. How? The question died on her lips. I found you, he said, clinging to a piece of a weather buoy. The storm pushed you far south of the shipping lanes. He looked at her, his gaze direct, unwavering. You're safe here, Serafina. Hearing her own name was an electric shock. It pulled her out of the fog and slammed her into reality. He knew who she was. Who are you? My name is Alexander Grayson, he said. He offered no title, no explanation, just a name. Rest. The doctor will be here in an hour. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the silence and 1,000 fractured questions. The next week was a slow crawl. A doctor, an older woman named Elena, with kind eyes and efficient hands, checked on her daily. She explained the damage in plain terms. 2 cracked ribs, severe hypothermic shock, saltwater aspiration. Then she held a Doppler to Serafina's still flat stomach, and the room filled with a fast, steady, whooshing sound. Thump, 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 thump. Her son's heartbeat. Strong. A fighter. That sound became her anchor in the disorienting sea of recovery. Alexander was a quiet, constant presence. He never asked what happened. He would simply appear with a tray of food or a fresh pitcher of water. He would sit in the chair in the corner and read for hours. His silence wasn't empty. It was watchful. From her window, she could see a stretch of white sand, then a barrier of jagged, black volcanic rock, and beyond that, the endless blue-gray ocean. There were no other houses, no boats on the horizon. It was a beautiful prison. Her memory returned in violent, unpredictable flashes. The scent of the antiseptic would suddenly be replaced by the phantom smell of Sloane's perfume, and she would gasp, her heart pounding. The clink of a glass against the pitcher would transport her back to the aft deck, to the sound of Damien slamming his whiskey glass down. At night, she'd wake up shivering, the crushing weight of the cold, black water a physical sensation. They weren't just memories, they were assaults. Sloane's cold smile, Damien's empty eyes, the shove, the impact, the receding lights of the Serenity. One afternoon, Alexander entered to find her standing, gripping the back of a chair, her knuckles white. She was staring out the window at the ocean, her body trembling with a rage that was finally burning through the fog of shock and pain. It wasn't a storm, she said, her voice a low, shaking whisper. She was talking to the ocean, to the memory. I didn't fall. He said nothing. He simply waited, his stillness an invitation for the truth he already knew was coming. She finally turned to face him, her eyes burning. The weakness was gone, replaced by a single, sharp point of absolute certainty. She pushed me, Serafina said, her voice clear and hard. His assistant, Sloane Redding, she pushed me, and my husband. He watched. Alexander's face remained calm, but something shifted in his gray eyes. His jaw tightened. He walked over to her, his presence no longer just watchful, but aligned. He looked at the undeniable truth in her eyes and gave a single, decisive nod. Then we find out why, he said. It wasn't a promise of comfort. It was a statement of intent. The next day, he led her from the medical wing through a corridor carved from the island's black volcanic rock. The corridor opened into a vast circular room without windows. The walls were a seamless bank of screens, currently displaying a serene, shifting pattern of deep blue light. In the center of the room sat a simple, large table. It was a command center. "What is this place?" Serafina whispered. "My office," Alexander answered. He sat down, and with a few keystrokes, the screens came to life with satellite maps and streams of raw data. My business is information. I find things powerful people pay a lot of money to keep hidden. He pulled up a maritime tracking map. A red line showed the path of the Serenity. They turned off their primary transponder here, he said, pointing to a spot on the map. But they forgot the backup. It pinged a satellite every 30 minutes. They drifted for 2 hours after you went in the water. Then, they turned and headed back to shore at full speed. They waited, Serafina said, her voice cold, to make sure I was gone. Yes, Alexander said. He typed another command. A new screen appeared, displaying encrypted financial data from Wolf Industries. And this is where the real story begins. He pointed to a series of wire transfers. The morning after they returned to port, your husband liquidated $50 million in unrestricted stock. The funds were transferred to a new holding company, registered in the Caymans 3 days before your trip. Serafina leaned closer, her mind, once occupied with charity galas, now clicking into a different gear. Her life sitting in on Damien's financial meetings, absorbing the jargon by osmosis, suddenly became a weapon. Wait, she said, pointing to a string of code in the registration documents. That's not a standard formation code. That's a Shell Corp identifier Damien uses for black box acquisitions. He told me it was for a European tech buyout. Alexander looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. He had the resources. She had the key. What else do you know? For the next 10 days they worked. Serafina, wrapped in a blanket, would sit at the table and guide Alexander through the labyrinth of Damien's corporate empire. She pointed out hidden slush funds, ghost employees on the payroll used for laundering money, and backdoor deals masked as consulting fees. She knew where the secrets were buried because she had unknowingly shaken hands with the men who buried them. She was no longer a victim. She was a strategist. One night, they were tracking a complex web of payments Sloan had funneled through 3 different countries. The pattern was intricate, designed to be untraceable. "Why are you doing this?" Serafina asked quietly. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing." Alexander stared at the screen, at the elegant criminal architecture of Sloan's fraud. He was silent for a long time. "When I was 16, he began, his voice low. "My father built a genetics company. It was his entire life. His partner, my uncle, was his best friend. Over 2 years, my uncle created a shadow company, funneled my father's research into it, and then orchestrated a hostile takeover using my father's own money. He pushed him out." He turned to look at her, and she saw a flicker of the 16-year-old boy behind the man's hardened face. "Not from a yacht, but from a boardroom. It's the same thing. My father died of a heart attack a year later. I learned then that monsters don't use claws. They use contracts." He looked back at the screen, at the web of deceit they were untangling. "I inherited what was left, and I built this. A system to find the truth the law is too slow or too expensive to uncover. I do this, Serafina, because I know what happens when men like Damien and women like Sloan win." The silence that followed was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. 2 people from different worlds, broken by the same brand of betrayal. "They tried to erase me," Serafina whispered, placing a hand on her pregnant belly. "They tried to erase my son." She looked at Alexander, her eyes clear and focused. "Let's erase their empire instead." The world mourned Serafina Wolf. News cycles ran 24/7 coverage of the tragic accident. Billionaire CEO's pregnant wife, lost in a sudden squall at sea. A massive search and rescue operation yielded nothing but a single, tattered life preserver. Damien Wolf played the grieving husband's part with impeccable precision. He gave a single, tearful press conference on the steps of his Manhattan home, his face a perfect mask of anguish. He spoke of her light, her kindness, her love for their unborn son. It was a masterful performance. The public wept with him. His company's stock, after a brief dip, rallied in sympathy. From a sterile apartment in Geneva, Serafina watched it all on a screen. The apartment was one of Alexander's many anonymous safe houses, a ghost property with no registered owner. Its windows overlooked a quiet, gray street, a world away from the sun-drenched island and the glittering cage of her former life. She was 6 months pregnant now, her belly a firm, constant reminder of what she was fighting for. She had a new name, a new passport, and a single, all-consuming purpose. She and Alexander had spent weeks in the command center mapping every secret of the Wolf Empire. Now they were in the execution phase. News reports would show Sloane Redding, a black veil partially obscuring her face, her hand resting supportively on Damien's arm as they left a memorial service. The tabloids called her the Loyal Rock, the devoted employee helping her shattered boss through an unspeakable tragedy. But Serafina had access to another feed. Alexander's network had compromised the security system in her old penthouse. She would watch Sloane direct contractors, her voice sharp and decisive, as they tore out the custom-built nursery Serafina had designed. She saw them roll up the antique Persian rugs, pack away her clothes, and carry out the furniture. Sloane wasn't just moving in. She was erasing every trace that Serafina had ever existed. "She's efficient," Alexander commented, watching the feed beside her. He was a constant, steady presence, a silent partner in this quiet war. "She's not just taking your life, she's liquidating it." Serafina placed a hand on her stomach, feeling a kick. "Good," she said, her voice cold and steady. "It will make it that much easier to take hers." The breakthrough came not from a financial ledger, but from a mundane maintenance log. While cross-referencing the yacht's service records, one of Alexander's analysts flagged an anomaly. A work order from 6 months prior for the installation of a specialized masthead atmospheric sensor. It was a high-resolution all-weather camera designed for meteorological data collection, not security. It ran on a separate, closed-loop system, completely independent of the yacht's main security feed. It recorded to a solid-state drive housed in a waterproof casing, and its data was uploaded via a separate satellite link. It was a ghost camera. "Did they know it was there?" Serafina asked, her heart beginning to pound. "Damien signed the work order," Alexander said, pointing to a digital signature on the screen. "But it was a minor upgrade, a $100,000 piece of equipment on a $40 million yacht. He probably forgot about it the second he signed." "Sloane wouldn't forget," Serafina said. "She never misses a detail." "She didn't need to," Alexander replied, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "The data uploads to a secure server at the manufacturer's headquarters in Norway. They wouldn't have access to it from the yacht. They couldn't erase what they couldn't reach." It took Alexander's team less than an hour to breach the Norwegian company's servers. Another 10 minutes to locate the files from the Serenity. A progress bar crawled across the screen as the file downloaded. It was time-stamped the night she went overboard. Alexander turned to her. "Are you sure you want to see this?" "I have to," she said. He nodded and dimmed the lights in the room. He clicked play. The screen filled with a high-angle, black-and-white view of the aft deck. The image was grainy, distorted by wind and rain, but it was clear. The audio was a howl of wind, but the microphone was sensitive enough to pick up voices. She saw herself walk to the railing. She saw Damien follow, and then she saw Sloane step out of the shadows. She watched the scene unfold as if it were a movie about a stranger. She heard the argument, words plucked by the wind. She saw Sloane's final dismissive words. And then she saw the shove. Fast, brutal, efficient motion. But it was what she saw next that broke her. She saw herself disappear over the railing. And she saw Damien. He didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He didn't rush to the edge. He took a small, involuntary step backward, a step away from the problem. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, his face a blank canvas, before Sloane turned and put a hand on his chest, guiding him back inside, out of the storm. It wasn't just a murder, it was an abdication. He hadn't just let her die, he had let himself be led away. Serafina didn't cry. She felt a cold, clean fire burn through her veins. The pain was gone, replaced by a clarity so absolute it was terrifying. She had seen the truth. Now, the world would too. She looked at Alexander. "They tried to erase me," she said, her voice a whisper of steel. "Let's erase their lies instead." Alexander uploaded the file to a secure, anonymous server. He attached a single line of text. "The truth from the Serenity." Then, he sent the link to a curated list of 200 of the world's most influential journalists, bloggers, and news agencies. He hit send at 8:00 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, just as the New York Stock Exchange was ringing its opening bell. The result was not a ripple. It was a nuclear detonation. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. It was on every major news network, on every social media feed, on every phone screen from New York to Tokyo. The world saw it. The grainy, undeniable footage of the shove, the perfect, grieving husband standing by, watching, the predator in the black dress, calm and in control. The collapse of Wolf Industries was immediate and catastrophic. The stock, which had opened at $250 a share, flatlined. The ticker symbol, WLF, was replaced by a string of zeros. Trading was halted, but it was already over. The company had lost billions in market value in seconds. It was the fastest self-destruction of a major corporation in modern history. The media erupted into a frenzy. News helicopters swarmed the Manhattan penthouse. Journalists camped outside the Wolf Industries headquarters. The public narrative shifted instantly from sympathy to outrage. Damien Wolf went from a tragic hero to a national villain in the time it took to watch a 30-second video clip. Some news pundits tried to spin it. Some say he was guilty, a willing accomplice from the start, one analyst argued on a cable news panel. Others claim he was just weak, a man frozen by shock, paralyzed by a manipulative sociopath. The debate was fierce. It fueled the fire, generating millions of comments, shares, and arguments online. Guilty or weak? It didn't matter. The empire was ashes. What do you think? Was he a monster or a coward? Does the difference even matter? Tell us in the comments, guilty or innocent. The arrest came that afternoon. A convoy of black SUVs descended on the penthouse. The cameras were there to capture it all. They didn't arrest Damien, not at first. They came for Sloane. She was led out in handcuffs, no longer looking poised and in control. Her face was a mask of furious disbelief. She screamed at the reporters, her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. The woman who had orchestrated a billion-dollar fraud and a cold-blooded murder was undone by a single, forgotten camera. The reckoning was swift. Facing irrefutable evidence and the full weight of public fury, Damien's carefully constructed world fell apart. His board resigned en masse. His lawyers quit. Left with no allies and no options, he crumbled. He wasn't arrested for murder, but for obstruction of justice, for filing a false police report, for the massive corporate fraud that the investigation had now uncovered. In a pre-trial deposition, he broke. He turned on Sloane, painting her as a manipulative mastermind who had poisoned his mind and controlled his actions. In return, from her jail cell, Sloane provided prosecutors with encrypted hard drives detailing every crime, every illegal transaction, every step of their plan. She implicated him in everything, attempting to drag him down into the abyss with her. They turned on each other like starving wolves, tearing apart the last remains of the life they had killed to build. From the quiet safety of the Geneva apartment, Serafina watched the headlines. Wolf Empire in ruins. The Yacht Pusher. Faces life in prison. Damien Wolf charged in largest fraud case of the decade. The news felt distant, like a story about someone else. Alexander stood by the window, a silent guardian. He had ensured her safety, creating layers of digital and physical protection around her that made her a ghost. The world was focused on the chaos, on the villains of the story. They had forgotten about the victim, and that was just how she wanted. Justice had found them. The scales had been rebalanced. But as she watched their faces flash across the screen, their lives in ruins, she felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet, hollow emptiness. 8 months after the world watched the Wolf Empire burn, the only news on the Isla del Silencio was the sound of the tide. The island was not a paradise. It was a fortress of white sand and black volcanic rock, a place of deliberate monastic quiet. In a minimalist room with a wall of glass overlooking the sea, Serafina Wolf held her son. His name was Leo. He was 3 months old, healthy and strong, with a shock of dark hair and his mother's observant, steady eyes. He knew nothing of yachts or betrayal or the fall of a corporate dynasty. His world was the warmth of his mother's arms and the rhythmic sound of her heartbeat. Serafina was no longer the woman who had stepped onto that yacht. The soft edges had been burned away, leaving a quiet, unshakable core of strength. She would walk the beaches with Leo strapped to her chest, not looking at the ocean with fear, but with a kind of cold, professional respect. It had tried to kill her. It had failed. They were now equals. Her days were marked by a new, simple routine. Leo's feedings, long walks along the black cliffs, and afternoons spent in the quiet of the island's library. Alexander had given her a tablet that was connected to a secure, untraceable email address. Through it, the outside world trickled in, not as a flood of news, but as a steady stream of messages from strangers. Thousands of them. They were mostly from women. A woman from Ohio who had finally left an abusive husband after 20 years. A junior executive in London who had gathered the courage to report her boss for fraud. An entrepreneur in California who had been cheated by her business partner and was now suing to get her company back. They all said the same thing, 100 different ways. Your story gave me strength. She never replied. She simply read, absorbing their stories, understanding that the fire she had started had lit 1,000 other small fires in the dark. She was no longer just Serafina Wolf, the victim. She was a symbol, a catalyst. One afternoon, reading a message from a young woman who had just won a small claims case against a contractor who had scammed her grandmother, she felt a small, unfamiliar sensation. Not happiness. Not triumph. It was a quiet sense of rightness. The scales of the world tilting back, one small weight at a time. Alexander's presence was a constant, steady hum in the background of her new life. He had become a quiet partner in raising her son. He would appear with a rare, imported part for Leo's crib, or a new set of data on early childhood cognitive development he thought she might find interesting. He never intruded, but he was always there. Their conversations were sparse, economical, but they were grounded in a shared reality that no one else on earth could understand. One evening, they sat on the terrace as the sun sank below the horizon, turning the sky to a bruised orange and purple. Leo was asleep in a bassinet beside them. For a long time neither spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the coarse grass on the dunes. "Do you ever wonder," Serafina said, her voice quiet, her eyes on the endless line where the water met the sky, "why do we survive the things that should end us?" Alexander was silent for a moment, swirling the ice in his glass. He looked from her to the sleeping child and then out at the darkening ocean. "When I was 16, after my father lost everything, I thought his legacy was gone. It was just a name on a building, a signature on a stock certificate. My uncle erased it with a pen. It was that easy." He took a slow breath, the memory still a physical weight. "What I've built here," he said, gesturing to the island, to the unseen network of servers and satellites that was his real home. "It has no name, no building. It's a system, a ghost. It can't be taken. It can't be erased." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes clear and direct in the dim light. "What you did, it wasn't just about taking Damien's money or putting Sloane in a cage. You destroyed the idea of them. You turned their power into a weakness. That can't be undone." He paused, looking at the last sliver of light on the horizon. "Maybe that's why we survive. We get a second chance to build something real, something that can't be erased." A comfortable silence settled between them. In that shared quiet, a new kind of foundation was being laid, built not on passion or romance, but on a bedrock of mutual respect and shared scars. A month later, on a calm, clear morning, Alexander approached her on the beach. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. In it was a single key. The key to a small, powerful motorboat moored in a hidden cove. She understood. She left Leo with Elena, the doctor, and went with him. They rowed in silence, the boat cutting a clean white line through the deep blue water. He navigated using a simple handheld GPS. After an hour, he cut the engines. The silence was absolute. The air was still. "These are the coordinates," he said, his voice low. She stood and walked to the edge of the boat. She looked down. The water was a brilliant, translucent blue, the sun penetrating deep. It was beautiful. Harmless. It looked nothing like the churning black monster of her memory. This was it, the place where Serafina Wolf was supposed to have died. Her grave. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth piece of black volcanic rock. A piece of the island. A piece of her sanctuary, her fortress. It was heavy in her palm, its edges worn smooth by the tide. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its solidity. She wasn't forgiving them. Forgiveness was a transaction she had no interest in making. This was for her. She looked at the coordinates on the GPS screen, then back at the water. She let the rock drop from her hand. It made a small quiet plink as it hit the surface and disappeared instantly, a piece of her new life sent down to claim the spot where her old one had ended. It was an anchor, a marker, a final, silent declaration that this place no longer had any power over her. She turned her back on the water and sat down. "Take me home," she said. The world moved on. Sloane Redding was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Damien Wolf, after a lengthy, humiliating trial, was sentenced to 20 years for fraud and obstruction of justice. His name now a permanent stain on the history of American business. The money, the empire, it was all gone, seized or scattered to the winds. But this story was never about them. It was about the quiet strength of a woman who was pushed into the abyss and refused to stay there. It's a reminder that the deepest betrayals often come from the people we trust the most. Has someone you trusted completely ever betrayed you? That moment when the floor falls out from under you, when you realize the person you loved was a stranger. Would you forgive Or would you fight back? Tell us below. Your story, your experience, might be the one thing someone else needs to read today to know they're not alone. Because sometimes life doesn't end where it falls apart. Sometimes that's exactly where it begins, with courage, with truth, and with the will to rise again. If this story moved you, subscribe, because justice deserves witnesses.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.